Welcome, Kingdom Builders. Welcome to the first of our 4 empowering sessions. I'm Ryan Bork, and today we have a transformative topic to delve into, discovering your passion as a kingdom builder. Ever wondered why we're here on this earth? What is the purpose of life? These timeless questions have profoundly shaped my journey. Picture this: I'm an 18-year-old accounting student at Chapman University, hit with a major curveball. Due to a car accident, I faced a debilitating medical setback. In that challenging time, I discovered Saddleback Church and Pastor Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life. Little did I know that was just the beginning of a transformative journey. Leading up to writing Kingdom Builders Playbook and launching this ministry was a path of self-discovery, life experience, and learning about biblical leadership, stewardship, and generosity. This playbook breaks down the fundamentals of being a kingdom builder into the areas of leadership, stewardship, and we even talk about taxes. But before we jump into the teachings, I'm thrilled and honored to introduce a dear friend and purpose-driven leader, Pastor Chris Goulard from Saddleback Church. With over 20 years of experience, he has been instrumental in helping people discover their purpose and navigate biblical financial stewardship. Pastor Chris is joining me at this teaching about life's purpose. I'll also interview him at the end of this session where he shares some of his purpose-driven journey. Welcome, Pastor Chris.
Thanks, Ryan. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to digging into this topic.
Great. Reflecting on life's mysteries, let's start by challenging the notion that everything happens accidentally. There's so many things that affirm the existence of a creator. While we obviously can't grasp the intricacies of the universe, life's purpose extends beyond personal benefits to contributing to the betterment of the world. Drawing from Pastor Rick Warren's perspective, life's purpose is about spiritual self-discovery and making the world a better place. It's about a deep relationship with God, discovering His plan for your life and serving others. These 5 purposes, worship, fellowship, discipleship, ministry, and my favorite, evangelism, provide a comprehensive guide for individuals seeking purpose-driven lives according to Christ's principles. Each purpose contributes to a holistic and fulfilling life centered around a personal relationship with God and meaningful connections with others. Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 to 39 summarizes the first 2 purposes, worship and fellowship. Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself." The primary purpose of life is to worship and have a deep, meaningful relationship with God. It's honoring who God is, acknowledging His sovereignty, and being grateful and seeking intimacy with God. Fellowship involves building authentic and supportive relationships with other believers, encouraging each other, and sharing the faith journey. Discipleship is the process of growing in faith and becoming more Christ-like. This purpose encourages continued learning, spiritual growth, and adherence to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Life gains purpose through serving others. Ministry is using your unique gifts and talents to positively impact the lives of others in and outside the Christian community. Evangelism is sharing the message of salvation and inviting others to experience a relationship with God the Father through Jesus Christ. Now, amid the countless ministry opportunities to serve God's kingdom and live out the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, the big question arises: how do we align ourselves with God's purpose for our life? If we're created for God's pleasure and to serve and love others, how do we figure out what we're supposed to do with our lives? How do we discover our kingdom builder strengths? Personality tests can help us understand ourselves better, your strengths and weaknesses, and how we interact with others. But people are multidimensional, and personality types serve as broad descriptions rather than strict definitions. You are uniquely made by God. All personality types have natural kingdom builder traits. My personal favorite is Myers-Briggs personality tests. Beyond personality tests, a valuable resource in discovering and understanding your shape, SHAPE, the acronym for spiritual gifts, heart, abilities, personality, and experiences. This incredible framework is taught in ministry class at Saddleback Church. Eric Reese, a former minister pastor at Saddleback, also wrote a book about the topic. It helped me determine my gifts and how to apply life's 5 purposes: worship, ministry, evangelism, fellowship, and discipleship, set out in Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life. Pastor Chris, let's talk about what a balanced kingdom builder is who seeks to live out a purpose-driven life.
Terrific. First of all, this is a fun topic because it applies to everybody. And we all want to feel like we're living a purposeful life. In Romans chapter 12, verses 6 to 8, we learn of the diversity of gifts within the body of Christ, where it says this: we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. So we're each called by our unique gifts and abilities to be part of the body of Christ, which is the Christian church. And being a kingdom builder is really about stewarding all that has been entrusted to us for God's glory. When thinking about kingdom builders and who we are, people often focus on money. And frankly, while money is a vital tool that we'll talk about in the series, kingdom building extends beyond finances. Jesus urges us to adopt an eternal perspective, and he says in the book of Matthew in chapter 6, verse 21, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So a balanced kingdom builder seeks to balance the growth in their spiritual, personal, family, professional life, and honors God in all of those areas. And really, this involves essential daily habits of seeking God through daily prayer, through Bible reading, through fellowship with other believers, and regular church attendance, among other things. There's plenty of other things we could talk about in addition to those. And by developing the proper habits, we eventually begin to grow spiritually. So this can also mean things like caring for our physical and emotional well-being, practicing self-care. It can mean cultivating healthy relationships with others. Sometimes it may even involve seeking professional help when we need it, or seeking wise counsel from trusted Christian friends and mentors, and by making sure that we prioritize rest and recreation and healthy habits. So regarding family life, a balanced kingdom builder is going to seek to love and serve their spouse sacrificially, cherishing them as a precious gift from God. A kingdom builder is going to be present and engaged in their children's lives, modeling God's love and grace and discipline as they raise them up. And serving as a spiritual leader, kingdom builders guide their family in relationships with God and in their Christian walk. So, finally, being a balanced kingdom builder involves being a responsible and productive member of society, working hard to provide for your family, serving in the community as Christ's ambassador. Really a balanced kingdom builder is a person of integrity and values and purpose who seeks to make a positive difference in the world and impact those around him or her for the kingdom of God. So we can see lots of examples of that around us, but let's watch this short video called I Like Bug Shells, because it's a beautiful illustration of kingdom building.
So I regularly try to take my little 5-year-old daughter out on daddy-daughter dates, and we go do all kinds of stuff. There was this one particular Saturday where she said, Dad, I think today for our date, I would like to go collect bug shells. She shows me this little cicada bug shell that's sure enough sitting on the side of the tree, and she says to me, Dad, my friend Adele and I would like to start a business collecting bug shells. I smiled and I said, okay, what are you going to do with the money that you make? And she said, well, we're going to buy people water with the money. There are kids in Africa who don't have clean drinking water, and we want to help get them water. I felt about that small, thinking she was just buying water for our neighbors. And so she goes and she tells my wife the same idea. My wife finally adjusts her business model and says, well, maybe instead of bug shells, you'd be able to ask people for pop cans and money. And so they start going door to door. She and her friend, they divide up the sales pitch. One of them says, we're collecting money and pop cans. And the other one says, for kids in Africa to have clean drinking water. And so they go house to house. They interact with all of these different neighbors. And eventually they raise $67.60. And I walk into our kitchen and they're sitting there lining up all the nickels and quarters and all the different pop cans, and they say, let's send it to World Vision's water team and we'll write them a letter. And so they write this letter to World Vision's water team, and they put the $67.60 into an envelope and send it off. We got a letter back from World Vision, and it's this organization that receives donations from all over the place. And in the letter, you could just tell how inspired they were by just this 5 and 7-year-old girl, just doing the kid thing, living it day in and day out. And this particular day, this is just what they decided to do. Was let's go help somebody have some clean drinking water. The day after they did all of this, my daughter walked up to me and she said, Dad, do you think I helped save somebody's life yesterday? And it was so cool to be able to say to her, yeah, I think you probably did.
Well, it's just heartwarming to witness young kingdom builders aged 5 and 7 displaying acts of kindness and generosity. This is a gentle reminder that giving knows no age boundaries, and you are never too young or too old to become a kingdom builder and be an example to others. At the core, kingdom builder is someone who, touched by a unique God-given calling, seeks to be an integral part of God's unfolding plan. It's not merely a term, but a heartfelt commitment for those with the gifts of leadership and generosity. As Christians, we're called to turn our successes into eternal significance with a kingdom impact on earth and heaven. To truly build God's kingdom, we must grasp the fundamentals of leadership and stewardship and understand the role of finances. Money is not just a financial resource, it's also a spiritual resource entrusted to us by God. How we handle our finances has eternal implications, and Jesus emphasized this in his teachings. Now, let's delve deeper into what it means to be a kingdom builder and discover practical ways to apply these principles in our lives. This is where the rubber meets the road, where our understanding of purpose transforms into tangible actions that glorify God and contribute to his kingdom. A kingdom builder's journey starts with a solid spiritual foundation. This involves regular prayer, deepening our connection with God, and staying rooted in the teachings of the Bible. As we build ourselves spiritually, we become better equipped vessels for God's work. A daily routine should include dedicated time for prayer and meditation on Scripture. It's a moment of grounding that sets the tone for the day ahead. I prefer an evening routine, but many find early mornings to be their best quiet time. Now, I want you to ask yourself, how can you enhance your spiritual foundation to align more closely with God's purpose? Each of us is uniquely designed with specific talents and passions. A kingdom builder takes the time to identify these gifts and align them with God's calling. It's about understanding where our skills meet the world's needs, creating a harmonious interplay between our individual purpose and the broader purpose of God's kingdom. When I discovered my passion for teaching and empowering others, it became clear that aligning this with God's purpose was my calling as a kingdom builder. So, what are your unique gifts and how can you use them to contribute to God's kingdom? Generosity is a cornerstone of kingdom building. It's not just about financial giving, but extends to our time, skills, and resources. When we live with open hands, ready to give, we become conduits of God's grace and love in the world. So I challenge you to find a tangible way this week to be generous. It could be as simple as offering a helping hand to someone in need or dedicating time to volunteer for a cause close to your heart. Let's actively participate in building God's kingdom through acts of generosity. Chris, can you elaborate on practical applications to bringing purpose to the daily life of a kingdom builder?
Absolutely. Love to, Ryan. As we've discussed, kingdom building isn't reserved for grand gestures. It's woven into the fabric of our daily lives. It's about intentionally infusing purpose into every interaction, whether at work, home, or within the community. When we do this, we'll be reflecting God's love, grace, and truth in all that we do. Let's bring this down to our daily routines and interactions, aligning them with the 5 purposes in the purpose-driven life. Consider how we can lead with integrity and kindness in our workplace, creating an environment where our colleagues or team members feel supported and genuinely valued. Our daily actions can testify to our commitment to kingdom principles, no matter how small. The first purpose, worship, reminds us that our primary focus is a meaningful relationship with God. Consider how our actions align with this purpose as we go about our day. Are we purposefully worshiping the Lord? Are we taking time for prayer, meditation, and deepening our connection with God? Infusing moments of spiritual reflection into our routine enhances our spiritual foundation, making us a better equipped vessel for God's kingdom work. Moving on to the second purpose, fellowship, emphasizes the importance in community. And in our workplace, we need to be intentional about fostering a sense of unity and belonging among our colleagues. We should share moments of joy and support during team meetings, creating an environment that reflects God's family-oriented purpose. It's also important to be part of an active community of believers, usually called a church. Likewise, we need to take care of our family at home, as those relationships are the most important of all. Now, the third purpose, discipleship, challenges us to grow spiritually. We talked earlier about the daily habits that can shape our lives, like being in the Word or spending time with the Lord every day. And giving is another habit that can stretch and grow us. Also, we should think about how we can contribute to other spiritual growth in our daily interactions. Encouraging others to grow in their faith also aligns with the purpose of becoming more Christ-like. The fourth purpose, ministry, challenges us to discover our unique gifts and talents. Ryan talked about SHAPE, S-H-A-P-E, which is one of the ways to look at how God has uniquely made us. Using that knowledge, we can reflect on our relationships and community and see where we can make a positive difference in the lives of others. Serving with joy and excellence, even in mundane tasks, contributes to the kingdom by utilizing your unique shape. And finally, the fifth purpose, evangelism, prompts us to always live with an eternal perspective. Our daily interactions can reflect this by considering the impact they have on the broader purpose of God's kingdom. Whether that's at home or work or within your community, intentionally seek ways to share the good news with those we encounter. Kingdom builders understand the intrinsic value of relationships. They go beyond personal connections. It's about fostering meaningful relationships that align with our values and contribute positively to our own spiritual growth as well. And building a network of like-minded individuals can strengthen our collective impact on God's kingdom. Plus, it's a lot of fun to grow and serve together. So, reflecting on my own journey, surrounding myself with fellow kingdom builders has been pivotal. We form a community that encourages and challenges one another to live out our purpose more authentically. Who are the individuals in your life who can help strengthen your kingdom impact? Seek out those who share your passion for building God's kingdom, because together you can make a more significant difference. As we navigate our daily lives, let's remember that kingdom building is not just about the grand moments, but about the consistent, purposeful actions that shape our character and influence those around us. Whether in the workplace, at home, or within your community, let's allow our daily interactions to reflect the love, grace, and truth that God has bestowed upon us.
That's just great wisdom. It's very impactful. Thank you, Chris. Before we close out our session, now it's time to have a conversation with Pastor Chris about his journey as a kingdom builder. Pastor Chris, I have some burning questions for you. Tell us about your business background, highlighting your journey from a finance career, transitioning into full-time ministry, and what led to your involvement in Kingdom Builders.
Those are great questions. My career really began back on the East Coast. I grew up in the East Coast. I worked on Wall Street for a little while, had a financial planning business. Then I transitioned into kind of a different role in the financial services industry and eventually moved out to California, where I am now, many years ago. But really a big thing for me was my involvement right away when I moved out to California in our local church at Saddleback Church. With some of the things we're going to talk about as far as purpose and how we dig into those kind of things, I became really involved with serving at the church, and I created some financial ministries to help people understand. So that's my connection with stewardship, right? God really was doing some big things in my life and used that as a way of springboarding me into helping other people in that same area. And so to me, that was, it kind of brought out and focused my purpose. It made me, created an awareness of my purpose through my own personal growth. And ultimately that led to the creation and building of ministries at the church. And I was a volunteer. So I did it as a volunteer, even though I was, traveling for work and trying to be a husband and a dad and serving in my church at the same time. There's a lot that I was juggling, but God was doing great things in my heart and started doing some really cool things at the church through it as well. And it became apparent to me that as somebody in financial services, that if I didn't understand really what the Bible was teaching about money, then probably nobody else did either, or very few. And I found out that was indeed true. It wasn't just me that didn't get it. And so as I, really studied into that and had started these ministries, it really led to a joy from that purpose of being able to pour into other people's lives, to build and see life change happening, to see how God was starting to work, and by using his principles, how God was starting to work in people's lives through those ministries. So that connected the ministry to it. Eventually, the executive pastor at the time at Saddleback, it was a long conversation, which I won't bore you with, but asked me to come on staff full time to basically build out these ministries and do some other things at the church. So it's now been really over 20 years that I left my career and have now spent more years as a pastor than I did in my original career at this point. So but that's how the transition happened. It's really more just me serving at the church, growing up in that, and then being invited to come on serve full time.
Well, I will say, I met you, and I kind of mentioned this in the book, after a debilitating health diagnosis back in 2010. And, I didn't realize how much, how big the ministry was and how many different offerings the ministry had, whether it was, Financial Peace University or, individual financial coaching or premarital counseling, estate planning ministry, financial freedom workshop, Crown and Compass Bible studies, and of course, putting on Journey of Generosity retreats or jogs, and just really, surrounding that whole person. And I know something that you've always said is, money and possessions can get in the way or be one of the biggest disconnects between somebody's faith and kind of furthering their walk with God. So that was obviously a huge decision that you made in your life. And I know, you obviously were approached by the church to do this. But what steps did you take to kind of discern or go through, like, is this really what I'm supposed to do? I mean, to give up, a career with millions of dollars of earning potential and kind of having that business hat on. Obviously it was a passion, but, I know from maybe a lot of our readers kind of from a business perspective, it's, an economic and business perspective, it's kind of like, wait, I've kind of built this career and gotten to this point, and like, how huge is that to kind of transition into being a pastor, and kind of what does that mean? So, I mean, how did you, what did you really feel? Did you feel the calling of the Holy Spirit? And like, how did you really discern and make that decision that this is what you were going to do?
Boy, that's a great question. And I'm asked that question a fair amount because I think people, as they're trying to discern in their own lives, they want to kind of look at those markers. For me, I was in my mid-30s at the time, and so I was young. I'd been very successful in my career, but my original thought was that I would go into full-time ministry when I could basically fully retire in my early 50s. That was my financial plan.
Okay.
Was that I'd continue to work, follow my career, get to the place where I could completely stop working, right? I wouldn't need income anymore.
Okay.
And I could basically retire and transition into full-time ministry in my early 50s. That was my plan. Which,
When did that come up? Because I know you obviously went to Saddleback when you were young. I don't know how old you were at that point. You're probably, what, 30?
29 when I started attending
29,
Saddleback.
okay.
Yep.
So you're young, you're 29 years old. I mean, what kind of stuck to you that like, hey, this is what I want my future to be? Like at some point in time, I'm going to get that financial freedom, or what was in your mind of that financial independence, financial freedom, and then kind of go, into ministry full time, or kind of become a pastor full time. I mean, that obviously there was the early decision, right? The early decision was, well, do I do this now in my 30s, versus waiting till my 50s? But what kind of planted into your mind, like, hey, like this is my next season of life. Like I'm going to do this season, and then I'm going to go into full-time ministry. And was it financial ministries when you decided you wanted to become a pastor, or was it just
I never wanted to be a pastor.
Okay.
Like honestly, when I thought ministry, I wasn't thinking pastor.
Okay.
Like I was never thinking lead pastor of the church or anything like that.
Okay.
And which I'm not, obviously,
Right.
anyway. But my thinking was really being able to just somehow serve the Lord full time. And I always thought that was just kind of this would be a great thing to do. And a lot of people think that, and it is a great thing to do.
With its own set of challenges.
100%, and more than I knew at the time. And at the time I was like, well, obviously I can't afford to do that now.
Right.
So that's not even
Right.
It never even occurred to me
Right.
to do it at a younger age. Honestly, at the initial stages. But as God, God just started really working in my life, and more, I would say sort of maybe the inflection point came because it's not. When I look back, it's almost like the yellow brick road, right? You go, I didn't even know where it was going. I just know that there are spots along the way. When I look back, God was clearly at work in a bunch of different things along the way. Some of that was things that were confirmed literally by asking friends to pray about things who felt like, I feel really like encouraging. God is definitely.
So there's these impressions that you were testing through kind of the proper means.
Yes,
these impressions like, hey, I really feel this impression. I feel called by the Holy Spirit into this direction. Pray for me. What do you think about this? And kind of,
because honestly, I think for most businessmen, probably for 99% of business people, going into full-time ministry is not the right decision.
No.
That was a unique calling to me.
Right.
It has been the right decision for me. I think God's used it. It's been fantastic.
Right.
But I think for most, frankly, the economy wouldn't work if everybody did that. Right?
I understand.
So it was different for me, and I had to get clarity around that. But there came a point, and the inflection point I was starting to refer to is really just that I'd come to a point in my life where I started, I think I maybe learned this from Pastor Rick. I'm not even sure where I first got it. But it's been a big thing, and I've kind of used it with other people as well. But waking up in the morning and say, all right, Lord, I'm not sure what you're going to ask me to do today, but the answer is yes. In other words, I don't even know what question you're asking me, but my answer to you will be yes.
So I'm just all in.
I'm all in. And that is a journey, but at some point
that can be scary in its own right too, right?
Oh yeah, it is. Well, and the truth is sometimes we go, hey, I'm all in, God, and the truth is, but please don't ask me to do that, right?
Exactly. You can ask me to do anything, but
so there were a lot of things that were confirmed along the way, and some of that was some things that my wife working through relationally. Some of it was in my small group and really having people pray over things. Some of it was what was happening in ministry and sort of watching what God was doing. So there were a lot of elements to it, but it came to a point where when the executive pastor, because that was the question. The question that was asked me is, what will it take? Well, I said, will you leave the business world, the real world, if you will, and come to work full time for the church? So when I was asked a direct question, now it's a question of, all right, Lord, I told you my answer is yes, and now I'm asked a question, and I can either say yes or no.
Right.
So I had already pre-decided.
Got it.
And that's one of those things where it wasn't like this super complicated decision-making thing, because I had already made the decision. And when that was put in front of me, the clarity had to come with, is this really what God wants me to do? In other words, is this the question he's really asking me through this executive pastor at the time? And myself, my wife, my friends, like everybody was in alignment going, yeah, this is, we believe God wants you to do this. So it wasn't done in a vacuum. It was over a period of literally a couple of years. It was a long period of time. But even right up until a couple of weeks before that, if you had said, hey, do you think you're going to become a pastor next month? I would have said, yeah, no. No, that's not my plan, right?
Yeah.
But when it was put in front of me, it became crystal clear. Does that make sense?
Right, yes. Yeah.
So maybe I'm just thick-headed enough. God had to make it super
clear. So an even
clear.
fun question, you really felt, I mean, this is clear as day, this is the direction I'm going. Did you still have any degree of anxiety making that decision?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I did. I mean, I would say there was a piece about it because I had a confidence in it.
Okay.
And I would say for somebody who's transitioning to ministry, one of the things that really helped me is my wife was also 100% on board. I mean, I've told friends, like, if you want to transition into ministry, but your wife or husband is
That's a
saying,
problem.
yeah, I'm not so sure, wait until they are also sure, because
Right.
it is a family decision.
Right.
She was 100% in. So I had that piece, but at the same time, you know, the financial planner in me, I'm still a certified financial planner. So the financial planner in me is going,
God math had to take over?
yeah, how do you take a 75% pay cut and
Right.
make that work? Like the math doesn't work.
Right.
So what do you do? Like, so
It's on
there was
step and
definitely
faith,
a
right?
lot of
Yeah.
anxiety that came in with that kind of thing. But ultimately God provided a piece through that, and the transition was great. And you know, there've been some challenges along the way, don't get me wrong, but it's really neat to be able to look back at it. It's very gratifying.
Well, I think it's just awesome, you know, whether it's, you know, Pastor Dave that we're going to hear from in a future session, or whether it's somebody like yourself, you know, to go from a very high capacity business background, and you know, worked on Wall Street, and, you know, Dave that we'll talk about kind of had his own background. I mean, to take something like that and go, hey, I'm going to transition into being a pastor is a huge deal. I mean, you don't hear that often. And I know, I'll share this context for folks that even go to smaller churches. You know, you get to a larger church environment, you know, have different pastors that do different things, right?
Yes.
So it's not necessarily a teaching pastor or a senior pastor. You know, I know, you know, your current role as a pastor is strategic advancement. You've also, you know, been the stewardship pastor, kind of serving that role for, you know, for 20 years.
20 years now, yeah.
So, I mean, it's pretty awesome when you have those types of resources in a larger church. And I want to kind of ask you, like, you know, what would you tell, you know, a pastor of a smaller church who's excited about maybe looking into a kingdom builders ministry, or kind of getting his high capacity folks together and stuff like that? I mean, you know, clearly Saddleback, you know, has, you know, so many resources. So what do you kind of tell that young pastor, a young leader who's in ministry, and kind of guide them?
Gosh, that's another good question. The smaller churches are sort of this, it's sort of a micro, macro type of thing, but smaller churches have similar challenges, and there's some advantages that smaller churches have as well. So in a big church, you say the advantage is we can specialize. In other words, we have the resources, we have the scale to be able to do specialization. In a smaller church, you don't have that luxury. But at the same time, you're also dealing with an easier environment in some senses, in that when you say, in a church environment where you got 20,000 people in the church, when you say, okay, who are the real kingdom builders, the people that are really focused, that are high capacity, that really want to make an impact here, you're dealing with a much larger number of people. In a small church, I mean, hopefully every Christian wants to make an impact, right? I mean, but when you really get down to the folks that we're talking about, you say, okay, in a smaller church, you're shepherding a smaller number of people. So that, in some senses, is easier. So creating a sense of community with those people, getting in a relationship with those people, trying to really disciple those people in that area, in some senses, is easier because there's just a lot fewer of them to work with.
Right.
So it can be done.
That's a let's get together, the 5 of us over coffee or something.
It could actually be that, and I've seen pastors do that very effectively.
Right.
In a smaller environment, the pastor actually is often in relationship with those people much more. Where in a big church, the senior pastor will have a handful of relationships, of course, but can't be in relationship with a large number. It's just not physically possible.
Sure.
And so you can't rely on the lead pastor in a big church that way. You have to specialize. So that's kind of the pros and cons between the two. But even somebody who's in a small church environment, the idea of, digging into a kingdom builder's ministry, I think is really great. I mean, and it can be very, very powerful.
So what do you think is, if you could teach one thing in your 20 years of being a pastor, what is that you share? What is that kind of summary of that 20 years? I mean, you started in business, you go into ministry full time, you get your master's in divinity, you're ordained a pastor, you go down the road of building out this just huge stewardship ministries. You take the steps to reach out to other pastors in a network and help them establish, stewardship ministries.
Yeah, which I love doing.
I know my goal in this whole project is to kind of box up a bunch of wisdom, whether it's, somebody who's kind of looking to make that journey from success to significance, or kind of, explore what being a kingdom builder is, or that young person who's just getting started out and kind of has access to, some of the greatest minds in stewardship and leadership and kind of all of these resources. I mean, how do you bottle that up? I mean, what is that one thing that you think you could share that you've learned in that 20 years?
Well, it's always dangerous to try and boil it down to one thing, but I would honestly say it's stewardship.
Okay.
And maybe because that's my personal passion.
Right.
But I really believe that sometimes people boil the word stewardship down to thinking about financial stuff,
right,
which again, my focus is on financial stuff. I get that. But when you look at the stewardship of your life,
right,
your time, your talents, your relationships, your body, there's so many other things that we are called to steward. But when you really boil it down and you say, okay, what does stewardship mean? The idea that I don't own anything, God owns everything, right? If I eat my body, my car, my family, my kids, all my wealth, whether that's a lot or a little, if I recognize that it all belongs to God, that necessarily changes how I view everything. It's easy to kind of say that in your head, like the idea of if I see somebody coming out of church on Sunday morning and say, hey, do you believe that God owns everything? And your normal churchgoer would go, yeah, I know that's the right answer, right? But do we really live that way?
Right.
And so that is, to me, the key, and why stewardship is such an important issue. And for somebody who really gets that issue, that is kind of one of the keys that unlocks the concept of being a kingdom builder, because you recognize it's not mine. I mean, it goes to the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, right, or some other places that we'll talk about.
Right.
But the idea that if I really believe that I am here on earth, not for my own benefit, not just to be happy, but I'm here to build God's kingdom, and God has put me here for some important reasons. When I get that, now my whole life becomes a pursuit of going after that purpose, making a difference, pouring into other people's lives, building God's kingdom. To me, that's the gas in the engine, right? I mean, that's really what makes it happen. So stewardship, I think, is the key that unlocks that concept of purpose, and I would also say generosity. Because if I recognize it's not mine in the first place, generosity becomes a different thing. It's not me, just, oh boy, I have to give up something of what is mine. No, it's God's stuff in the first place. And if God's calling me to use that to build his kingdom, I willfully, joyfully want to do that.
Right.
Right? It changes the nature of that decision and the spirit behind it and the attitude behind it.
Yeah, I know with stewardship, I know something in my life, I know something we talk about in the book too, is just, it's just burning into your mind, branding that into your brain that you got to keep an eternal perspective. So it's not the here and now. It's not the 80 to 100 years on this planet if you're lucky. It's, what am I doing to build God's kingdom here? And something that you touched on too, and we talk about this well, is this, this concept that, what is a balanced kingdom builder, right? So it's not necessarily somebody who is a hard charger who works 100 hours a week, who's full speed ahead, who's, let me just generate the most that I can and, give the most that I can, to kingdom purposes. And it's really, hey, do I have a purpose-driven business? Am I giving, but am I prioritizing my health? Or am I prioritizing a quiet time with God, or time in the Word, or time, to be a leader, in the home, to my family, to spend time with my kids? So, how do you kind of balance all of that out, right? I mean, it's not just being heavily focused in one area, but I mean, you'd probably agree. I mean, just keeping an eternal perspective.
Yeah, it's very important.
What am I doing right now, and what does that look like in light of eternity? Not so much what's the impact of that here, which is still a valid point, but what is that in light of eternity? I think having an eternal perspective ties into that whole, God owns it all.
And it's a question we have to ask ourselves over time. I mean, it's not like a one-time question, right? It's something that we have to ask continually. How am I doing? If I step back, am I keeping an eternal perspective? I mean, I have to ask myself that question. Am I keeping an eternal perspective? Am I really living that way?
Right.
It's hard, right? As the world is constantly pulling us the other direction. The world wants us to, Satan wants to distract us, right? And keep us on the sidelines. And so that question is a very important one of, am I on that? And so let me just dig into something you just said about a kingdom builder perspective. The idea of being balanced, I think, is really key, because I've known business people who have said, I'm going to earn as much as I possibly can so that I can give away as much as I possibly can.
Right.
And I actually think that's a very honorable goal.
Sure.
But it can really get out of balance. And I've seen sometimes where that happens, where just, they're earning as much as they can, meaning they're making their business as profitable as possible.
Right.
But are they doing it at the expense of not treating employees well and underpaying them and those kind of things? Like, to me, that's not a kingdom builder attitude. It's not the attitude of, really being grateful to God for everything and really having this mindset that God is my provider and He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and He can give me everything I need, right? It's that the idea of God can provide everything, and so therefore I can be generous, and I can be generous with my employees, and I can still make a good living at the same time.
Right.
And so that, I like how you get into that balance perspective and you talk about balancing those purposes, because I think that's a much, frankly, healthier way, and I think it's really what Jesus modeled.
So how would you, someone like myself or some other kingdom builders, I know at least at Saddleback, we have, access to pastors like yourself. You guys come alongside us. That's just not something that's available to everybody.
Right.
For somebody watching this, what are some practical things that somebody can do to kind of find their purpose, discover their purpose? Like, they're trying to figure it out. Hey, I have this business, or I just took on this leadership role, or, how do I kind of navigate that? Like, how do I actually find my purpose? Especially younger folks are kind of just getting started out. They haven't had, 20, 30, 40 years under their belt to kind of, crisscross and zigzag trying to get there. So, what is that, what is that direct path? How can you avoid a lot of these pitfalls? We all, grow through kind of these, setbacks.
Yeah, we do.
But, what is that direct line? Like, how does somebody kind of find their purpose?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think, if I may, you're a good example of how that can happen. I remember you coming to me, and you were young, and you were young and hungry, and you were like, I want to learn, I want to grow, I want to fulfill God's purposes. So some of it is that hunger and desire. And I think, God puts that in our heart, but at the same time, as a Christ follower, as somebody who really wants to serve the Lord, we all have to kind of build that up in ourselves, right? So yes, sometimes that calling can come from God, right? But at the same time, we have to work on motivating ourselves to really make sure we're on track. But that means going out and saying, what are the resources around me? These days, there are so many, look what we're doing right now.
Right.
This wasn't available in the past, right? Now
Sure.
It is. What are the books available? Who are the people I can tap into?
Right.
There's networks, even on the internet. I can go do research through things like, if your passion is stewardship, as an example, which
Right.
for most people may not be, but for
Sure.
me it is. But I can go to websites like the ChristianStewardshipNetwork.com, or, and I can go to Generous Giving. I can go to other organizations and personally dig into what is my purpose and how do I build that out?
Right.
And like you said, look, there are going to be pain points, there are going to be mistakes we make. That's normal.
Overnight success, 30 years in the making.
Yeah, exactly. People go, oh, look, overnight success. Yeah, 30 years.
How do
that
I
guy's
get
been
there?
building that up.
How do I get there tomorrow? What's my 24-hour solution to lose 30 pounds. No.
Right. Well, that's part of our
It's kind
culture,
of our society.
right?
Yeah, it's kind of our culture. We want it now.
Yeah, we want
want
it
to just
in a
get
TikTok
straight to
video.
it.
Like,
And I
here's
think
how
that
to
is
do that.
part of what we're trying to do. But, I do appreciate you saying that. I mean, there are just so many great resources that are out there today that just weren't out there. Whether it's Crown Bible Studies, Compass, something like, Generous Giving, and, something like Christian Stewardship Network, and really helping churches plant stewardship ministries. And, I think you also help identify some kingdom builders through those types of ministries, right? You have those, whether it's business, you can, apply that to church. I don't want to call it church business, but you have those touch points, right? And you're trying to engage these people, and you kind of really find out what makes them tick. And you may have a big room of people, and you go, here's those couple outliers, where you're like, hey, I can plug them into this space. I can plug them into kingdom builders, and, really minister to these folks where, that doesn't really exist. So
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the word kingdom builders maybe could be clarified a bit, because we can live out our purpose, and anybody can be a kingdom builder, right?
Sure.
So, I could become a missionary and move to the jungle in South America or something
Right.
like that, and that person is a kingdom builder in the one sense, right?
Sure.
But I think the sense we're talking about is when people say, wait a minute, I'm successful in business, I'm successful in, maybe I own a business or my career or whatever it might be.
Or capacity to give, or
Right,
Sure.
and I want to take that, and I want to, yes, God has used that as provision for my family,
Right.
but beyond that, it's provision for his whole family, right? And so how do I turn the corner from being focused on just building my kingdom to really building his kingdom, and saying, if God has provided me with all these resources, yes, I can do this for my family, but rather than saying I want more and more for my family and keeping it to myself, I'm going to say, my lifestyle doesn't need to grow. I'm content with this, right?
Right.
Like the Apostle Paul said, I'm content with a lot or a little.
Sure.
So if I can be content with that, then that means really anything else can actually go towards the kingdom.
Right.
And it leads to, investing differently, giving differently, serving differently, connecting with other organizations. There's so many aspects you could really talk about with it.
Yeah, and I'd say one of those moments, I'm sure you've had those too, which is fun, is, giving when you don't have it. Or even what's fun is pre-giving. You're like, I don't know what the future's going to hold, but I'm going to pre-give now and just shoot some goals and hope for the best, and kind of, having the right heart, right? And I know we talk about that too, but having your heart in the right place and not doing something out of duty. But generosity can be fun.
Oh, it is a lot of
It
fun.
can be fun, and you get so much more out of giving than you do out of getting. So, well, as we close up our interview, do you have any words of encouragement? How do we get the fire in the belly? How do we, maybe share a message from what you've learned in your time in not only business but also in a pastor? And what sort of words of encouragement could you offer, current or prospective kingdom builders?
Well, one of the things that I would say for somebody who's really sort of, and which is not uncommon, by the way, for people to say, really, I'm kind of really trying to identify my purpose. I'm struggling with that. What does God really want me doing? We talked about shape, and I think going back to shape is really a key thing, because if God has given us gifts in a certain area, we should pursue that, right? If God has given us experience in a certain area. Now, sometimes that could be business experience.
Right.
Sometimes that could be, it could literally be a tragedy or a very painful point. For some people, they've gone through a trauma. Well, then maybe part of your calling is helping other people that are going through something similar or may go through something similar. And you can speak into that in a way that is entirely unique that I wouldn't be able to do, right? So identifying your purpose and your ability to serve and your ability to do things in God's kingdom is really important. But then once you've identified it, going after it, it's kind of like anything else. There are some people that are highly motivated to get things done, and then there's others that maybe not so much.
Right.
But whatever it is that causes you, if it's something that is your purpose, you're going to have fun doing it. Typically, you're going to enjoy it. You're going to have fulfillment, even if it's hard. So somebody who's working with people who are really struggling, you might think, well, that's not fun. Actually, it is, because by helping people through something, there's gratification when you go home at night and man, that was hard, and yet I know I just made a huge difference in that person's life, right? And that's very gratifying, can be very fulfilling to do that. And so when we tap into those things where God has gifted us, it's the SHAPE, right? When we tap
Right.
into those things, that can paint that picture for us. And then the only other thing I'd say with that is for those that have kind of figured that out and gone after that, how do you build community around it? In other words, when I started as a stewardship pastor at Saddleback, 20 years ago, a friend of mine said, hey, you got to figure out who else is doing this around the country. Because I was like, I didn't know any stewardship pastors at all, right? And so I reached out to some other large churches around the country and said, what are you doing with this? Who is the person at your church that does this?
Sure.
A lot of churches didn't even have anything in that space back then. So, but there was a group of us that kind of formed, and we found each other, and that eventually became the Christian Stewardship Network. But that really is, to me, could happen in any space. So whatever your calling is, whatever you feel that purpose is, some people, I know I've worked with some business people who feel really called to make a big difference in a particular country in Africa and do some things that can help shape their economy, can do things for employment, there's all kinds of things that people can do. And if God's calling you something, like, go after it. Find other people, because, I really feel like God didn't call us to do everything alone. Like,
We are better together,
we're
right?
better together, right? We've all heard
Used that for so many years. We're better together, and really are. Even I'd say with a lot of startups that I worked with or young CEOs, it's so easy to isolate yourself, and you're like, this is my vision. I have to do this. But part of developing those leadership skills is, how do I include others and get other people, to see this vision and kind of, jump on the bandwagon.
Well, a lot of kingdom builders are good leaders, right?
Right.
So there may be even in your church environment, there may be other people at your church, and we didn't have stewardship ministries at Saddleback 20 years ago.
Right.
But what I found was once I started digging in and building it and started reaching out to people that I knew that either I had done some Bible studies with, or maybe they were just a financial advisor who went to the church, and I said, hey, what do you feel about, would you be willing to serve in ministry and use your skills? And when asked, then all of a sudden they were like, oh, I didn't know I could do that, right? Well, it didn't exist until all of a sudden I started it, right? So that happened to be me in that case. But whatever that might be, is there a place to serve and invite other people into that process and build a team? Right. I think the church a lot of times...
Well, even in stewardship ministries, at one point, how many people were volunteering the ministry? It was well over 100, wasn't it?
I don't know if we ever got over 100, but we got close to it along the way, and it became bigger. And then, there's seasons that it goes up and down, but in a big church, we have a lot of things going on. That's the size of a
lot of churches.
Yeah,
it's just,
yeah.
Could
and I was
make
sort
your
of
own
pastoring
church with
my area.
Exactly, right.
Which was super fun. And whether that's a large church or small church, if you find the other people to do it together, I think you can build momentum. There's just so many benefits that come out of that. We could list them all, but so those would be the two things. One is really clarify what is your purpose with that,
right?
And wrestle with that. That became clear to me over time, and eventually led to me coming on staff. But even if I hadn't gone on, that was a big transition, like we talked about. But if I had not done that, I still had that purpose, right? Even if I'm just being a volunteer or serving in ministry, I can live that out fully while still, being fully employed somewhere else at the same time. I can still 100% pursue that purpose.
And I think it's you probably agree, it's not so much like, I'm called into ministry. That doesn't mean it has to be full time. Some people don't have as much latitude or flexibility of really, making their workplace a ministry. They can start a Bible group during a lunch break or something. Some people just don't have that ability, but they're just so many opportunities, especially if you're kind of an entrepreneurial mindset to really go to your church and look into stewardship, right? I know, like we said, ChristianStewardshipNetwork.com is a great place to look, but, how do we start a stewardship ministry? How do we kind of deep dive into these things? And I know I would say, and you'd probably agree, is that, take a look at some of the resources that are out there. You'll get excited just really diving into what's focused in God's word about leadership and stewardship and generosity, and so many great stories in the Bible. And I know we talk about how much Jesus spent in his ministry just talking about money and possessions and things like that. So clearly it's a topic that's important to God, And clearly it's something that he wants us to develop in our lives. And, as we say, God's more interested in our character than our comfort. And I think we could really build our character in the areas of leadership and stewardship and generosity. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much for taking your time. We did promise this interview, and I hope everybody looks forward to the additional teaching and stuff like that through the following sessions. So thanks so much for sitting down with me. Well, that wraps it up for today. But before we say goodbye, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed so far. We've spoken about the ultimate question of why we're here on earth and ways to discover our purpose. We also discussed that a kingdom builder lives a balanced life in all areas. It's more than a grand gesture. It's about infusing purpose into our daily routines and relationships, reflecting God's love, grace, and truth. And didn't that heartwarming video, I Like Bug Shells, beautifully illustrate that kingdom building knows no age boundaries? Young or old, each of us plays a vital role in God's unfolding plan. So, as we wrap up today, reflect on how you can actively participate in building God's kingdom through acts of generosity and purposeful living.
Absolutely. Strengthen your spiritual foundation. Some of the stuff we talked about is so key. Identify your unique calling and learn to be generous with your time, your skills, your resources. If you surround yourself with kingdom builders who, other people like yourself to encourage and challenge you on your journey, you're going to go a lot farther and a lot faster. So think about how you can practically apply some of the principles we've talked about in your life. And remember, kingdom building is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing. Each step forward contributes to the greater purpose that God has for you in his kingdom.
Well, stay tuned for the next segment where Pastor Chris and I will delve into the crucial stewardship roles in kingdom building, and our special guest is Pastor Dave Arnold. Until then, reflect, apply, and remember that each step forward contributes to God's greater purpose for you in his kingdom. The questions in your workbook should help you on your kingdom building journey. Thank you for joining us on this empowering journey together as we build his kingdom.